In 1886, a manuscript was discovered that had remained hidden in the ancient city of Hmin, located in Egypt, which was known in ancient times as Heliopolis, a name given to it by the Greeks. A group of archaeologists made a significant discovery when they found a manuscript inside a tomb. This discovery generated a great deal of excitement and curiosity in academic circles and among specialists, since the manuscript in question contained a total of 4 texts. Among these texts, one stood out for having the title The Gospel According to Peter, which implies that it is a narrative describing the life of Jesus and was written by Peter himself, who was the leader of the apostles. This direct connection with a central figure in Christianity further emphasized the interest surrounding the discovered manuscript. The Gospels that currently make up the Bible are traditionally attributed to the authors known as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who are the 4 Gospel writers. However, it is important to emphasize that none of the items mentioned or ideas discussed are directly associated with Peter. However, it is important to emphasize that, even with all the nuances of history, there is knowledge that, from ancient times, there was a document known as the Gospel according to Peter. This text was not only carefully read and analyzed by various Christians of the time, but was also frequently used in their religious practices. Furthermore, it is worth noting that it went through a process of approval and rejection by certain groups of early Christians. Previously, the information we had about the text only referred to indirect mentions in ancient documents. However, new discoveries have enabled us to obtain the original text in concrete form. This allows us not only to discuss its content in detail, but also to analyze some relevant aspects of the historical importance of this specific document. In addition, we can investigate and debate what it represents for the history of Christianity, especially with regard to ancient Christianity. Furthermore, it is essential to reflect on the reasons for the absence of this text in the versions of the Bibles we know today, especially when considering the content of the so-called Gospel of Peter, which deserves our attention. What is your opinion on this? This ancient document states that the events mentioned took place during the time when Jesus was alive, doesn't it? What distinctions can we observe in this gospel when we compare it to the more famous narrative that is currently present in the Bible? Unfortunately, the content presented in this text is not in full or complete form. The manuscript we have in our hands is fully finalized and does not have any fragmented or missing parts. However, it is important to emphasize that this work was based on a previous document which, in turn, was incomplete, i.e. it did not contain all the information necessary for its completion. Therefore, what we currently have in our hands relating to this gospel attributed to Peter is significantly restricted to its final part, which consists of the narrative describing Jesus' trial, followed by his execution and, finally, his resurrection. In this way, we can consider that the Gospel of Peter resembles the last chapters of the canonical Gospels in many respects. It's important to emphasize that there are several elements in this gospel that are similar to those found in the canonical texts, but there are also particularities that differ. For example, at a crucial moment, instead of the inscription that usually says King of the Jews on the cross, the text mentions King of Israel. Furthermore, when analyzing the last words attributed to Jesus in Peter's Gospel, one realizes that they are not the traditional expressions, my God, why have you forsaken me? Or Lord, into your hands I commend my spirit. Instead, he says, my power, you have forsaken me, thus revealing a different form of expression that emphasizes a particular nuance in this narrative. We'll return to this phrase throughout the video, as it has a meaning that can be very interesting for us to reflect on a doctrine that was part of early Christianity, called Docetism. However, before we get into this topic, it's essential to highlight some of the most notable differences between this gospel and those that are more widely recognized. One aspect that really stands out in this gospel is that Jesus' trial is not conducted by the governor Pilate, as it is in the canonical Gospels, but by Pontius Pilate, who was the prefect of Judea at the time. This particularity is quite relevant, isn't it? Pontius Pilate is the figure who takes responsibility, isn't he? The person in charge of the trial is the figure who issues the sentence that culminates in Jesus being condemned to death, as told in the Gospel that bears Peter's name. The person responsible for conducting the trial was Herod Antipas, who was governor of the region of Galilee. He was therefore a figure of authority within the Jewish context of the time, correct? According to the Gospel attributed to Peter, it can be said that Pilate exercised no authority as a Roman figure, which implies that, in this narrative context, he really had no responsibility in relation to Jesus' trial, correct? The city of Rome as a whole cannot be held responsible for the execution of Jesus Christ. All the blame and responsibility for this event fell entirely on God is a concept that encompasses a supreme figure or entity considered to be the creator and ruler of the universe, and is venerated in various religious traditions around the world. This representation can vary significantly from one religion to another, and is often associated with attributes such as omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence. In addition, the idea of God can be a central presence in spiritual practices, reflecting the human search for understanding, purpose, and connection with something greater. Throughout history, the divine figure has been the subject of philosophical, theological, and cultural debates, leading to different interpretations and reflections on the existence and nature of the sacred. We'll return to this issue at a later date. One very fascinating aspect in which the Gospel of Peter differs from the canonical Gospels is in the way it portrays the resurrection of Jesus Christ. According to the text of this Gospel, two heavenly beings descended from heaven and entered the tomb. From this place, they took Jesus, who in turn came out in a form that made him appear larger than the other two, or at least ascending to higher heights compared to them. In this impressive way, Jesus emerged from the tomb in a fully visible form, so that all the people who were present were able to observe this scene with total clarity and sharpness. Therefore, the Gospel attributed to Peter presents an abundance of witnesses reporting Jesus' resurrection, which is quite significant. In addition, an intriguing aspect worth highlighting is the fact that, as stated in Peter's Gospel, the cross itself was placed inside the tomb, which provokes reflection on the symbolism of this act. Thus, at the moment when the resurrection takes place, the cross also emerges from the tomb, and an inquiry is addressed to Jesus. A voice from heaven asks if he has prepared himself to proclaim the gospel to the departed. The text, in turn, reports that the cross confirmed this in the affirmative. In this passage, some of the most significant aspects of the narrative in the Gospel of Peter are listed, highlighting the differences between this version and the accounts of the Passion and Resurrection in the canonical Gospels. These differences reflect matters that are crucial to understanding how each text approaches the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, revealing different interpretations that enrich the study of the foundations of Christian tradition. Later on, we will have the opportunity to analyze other more detailed aspects of this narrative. However, before we go any further, it is essential to consider the importance of this text in relation to the history of Christianity. We need to investigate how this document was perceived, how it was received, and how it circulated among people in antiquity, as well as whether it was accepted or if it suffered some form of rejection during this period. What is the reason why this particular text is not found in contemporary versions of the Bible? So, as I mentioned earlier, various writers from the past address the existence of a gospel attributed to Peter. These ancient authors, in their works, make references to this text which relates directly to the figure of one of the most prominent apostles. The gospel that is cited as possibly having been written by Peter is mentioned by one of the most important authors of antiquity, Eusebius of Caesarea. This important 4th century writer plays a fundamental role in understanding the trajectory of early Christianity. Eusebius relates an account of the Gospel of Peter which, according to him, took place in the 2nd century, 100 years after the death of Christ. In this account, Eusebius mentions a bishop who was active in Antioch, known by the name of Serapion. During his wanderings, this bishop visited a town in Syria called Rossos. In Rossos, he found a Christian community that was using a text called the Gospel according to Peter, thus demonstrating the circulation and use of this text among the Christians of that time. At first, Serapion was unfamiliar with the text of the Gospel according to Peter, but he didn't see it as a negative or problematic issue that other people were interested in reading it. He hadn't yet read the text, but he expressed his approval, guaranteeing that if the only thing that causes disagreement in the community is uncertainty about the possibility of reading this document, then it should be read. However, at a later date, Serapion discovered that this text was linked to a group known as the Dosti or Doceters, who were seen as heretics when analyzing the beliefs and acceptances of that time. In other words, those who were considered heterodox, at least, held views that opposed what was considered the proper opinion according to Serapion and his group. With this information in mind, this bishop finally decides to read the Gospel and, in doing so, comes to the conclusion that, for the most part, the content of Peter's Gospel is in line with a doctrine that is correct and true about the Savior. According to the analysis of the content, it can be affirmed that this Gospel presents an essentially orthodox basis. However, in certain aspects, it contains additional doctrines that contradict the traditional orthodox perspective. Furthermore, it is important to emphasize that the text states that the Apostle Peter never wrote a Gospel, which also deviates from accepted doctrine. In this way, this Gospel in question would present an authorship that would not be true, and therefore this lack of authenticity in its authorship, together with its disagreement with orthodoxy, would stand out as significant aspects to be considered. Serapion, in writing his work, expresses a clear disapproval and strong condemnation of the use of the Gospel attributed to Peter. In this sense, He reverses his previous position, emphatically stating that the reading of this gospel, which he considers good, is not permitted. You may be wondering about the identity of these individuals known as Ties de Docese. Do you have any hypotheses or ideas about them? The Gospel of Peter is a work that is considered to be attributed to Marcion of Sinope, who is a very important figure in the history of early Christianity. Marcion defended a radical conception of the nature of Jesus Christ, maintaining that he possessed absolute divinity, representing 100% divinity, while his human part, that is, his human essence, his corporeality, and physical nature itself, were seen as merely apparent and illusory, without a substantial reality. This perspective on Jesus' humanity challenged the conventional notions of the time and generated intense theological debates among the early Christians. In the early days of Christianity, it was understood that Jesus possessed exclusively a divine nature, without any human aspect. This concept is often referred to as Docetism, although this term has another interpretation that can be found in certain Gnostic writings. In these texts, it is presented that Jesus and Christ are not the same entity, but two distinct figures. In a specific way, Jesus is described as a person of fully human nature, while Christ is characterized as an entity of divine nature. Thus, this differentiation between the two figures becomes a relevant point of discussion within this perspective. The notion of Christ, also referred to as the Logos, suggests that, according to this perspective, what really happened was that the Logos did indeed manifest or become present, correct? According to the theological perspective, it is possible to affirm that the divine figure of Christ, who is considered sacred and of a divine nature, would have somehow inhabited or influenced the human being Jesus on various occasions, especially at the moment of his baptism. This relationship between the divinity of Christ and the humanity of Jesus suggests a deep and meaningful connection, which can be interpreted in various ways within religious understanding. It is in this context that the idea is established that the divine presence manifested itself many times in the life of the man Jesus, especially at the special moment of baptism, which is a rite full of symbolism and spiritual importance. Therefore, when we analyze the moment when Jesus receives baptism, we can conclude that he is in a condition of imperativeness, can't we? In the context presented, it can be seen that the person in question, on finding himself in that place, is enveloped in a way that connects him to the Logos, a principle that represents reason and the divine word, allowing him to experience a state of divinity. However, this divinity is temporary and occurs while he is influenced or inhabited by the presence of Christ, who is the manifestation of the Logos. Later, when Jesus' crucifixion takes place, the Logos withdraws in this way, leaving Jesus. At this crucial moment, the figure who surrenders to death is only the human representation of Jesus, which implies that the divine essence is not what experiences mortality. This conception, which distinguishes between divine aptitude and human experience, is also a belief associated with the Docetism movement, correct? Which specific section of Peter's Gospel presents concepts that are similar to these? There are certain passages in the Gospel of Peter that could be interpreted as alluding to these doctrines. It is important to emphasize that these parts can be read from this perspective, although they are not necessarily seen in this way, but rather as a reading possibility that opens up an understanding of the concepts involved. An illustrative example would be the moment when Jesus is being crucified. In this context, the narration mentions that he didn't seem to experience pain, which leads to an interesting interpretation. When we analyze this passage from the perspective of Ketia, we can see an illusion that Jesus' corporeality was, in fact, merely illusory or superficial. This idea suggests that the essence of physical suffering may not have manifested itself in an authentic way, indicating a deeper dimension to his existence. Because of this, the individual in question did not experience any form of physical suffering in that place. In addition, there is a passage that is sometimes interpreted in a softer way. This passage concerns the words spoken by Jesus while on the cross, when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" According to some scholars' interpretation of this passage, Jesus was alluding to the fact that Christ had distanced himself from Jesus at a crucial moment. Christ, who is recognized as the divine entity, letting go of his human nature would, according to some interpretations, result in an abandonment of the power that Jesus possessed. This interpretation is one of the possible readings on the subject. In addition, a third aspect that is often emphasized by scholars and commentators is the question of Jesus' death on the cross. According to the sacred text, when he died, it is mentioned that his essence or soul was raised towards heaven. However, it is important to note that his body remained hanging on the cross. This situation is such that Jesus' body will later be removed from the cross and buried. The question that arises from this is, what exactly was taken up in this context? It is possible that this statement refers to the event in which Christ was taken up, leaving behind only the physical body of Jesus on the cross. In this sense, it is important to note that these passages can relate to experiences of silence or absence, which can be seen as a form of euphemism. Furthermore, the expression "my power," repeated in this analysis, could be interpreted as an allusion to the cry "O my God," found in Matthew's Gospel. However, the author of this text could be choosing to use a different terminology for the word God, possibly with the intention of avoiding the frequent and common use of this term, which was widely used in antiquity. This strategy may indicate a search for more respectful or deliberate tone when addressing the issue of divinity. You refrain from using the term God, just as the author does. The author of Matthew's Gospel in other passages says kingdom of heaven, often avoiding the term kingdom of God as it appears in Luke and other Gospels, and this may also be the case with the expression raptured. The author may have been using this expression that Jesus was raptured as a euphemism for Jesus died. So there is nothing that requires a literal or direct reading of these expressions. They may have been put there in a figurative sense, and there's another detail too, which is a passage in Peter's Gospel which is directly contrary to any dose. So why, according to Peter's Gospel, when Jesus was taken down from the cross it generated an earthquake? This also appears in Matthew's Gospel. But in Peter's Gospel the author makes a point of specifying that the earthquake happens when Jesus' body is placed on the ground. So when Jesus' dead body touches the ground it generates an earthquake, and the question is this, right? If we're reading this text and we understand that the authors are Docetists, we would expect them not to value the materiality of Jesus. So what would be the point of linking an event that is considered extraordinary, right? A miracle, with the physicality of Jesus, specifically saying that when Jesus is placed on the ground is what causes an earthquake, then this gospel is at least ambiguous in its understanding of Jesus. Whether he is a Docetist or not is not something that is explicit in the text. It's very different from the case, for example, of the so-called Coptic Apocalypse of Peter, which is another text. It has nothing to do with this. But the CTA Apocalypse of Peter has passages that are explicitly skeptical. For example, I'm going to read just one here. It says the following: "The one who comes smiling and laughing atop the cross is the living Jesus. The one into whose hands and feet they hammer nails is his fleshly part, is his substitute. They are humiliating the one who has taken on the likeness of the living Jesus." So here in this passage you clearly have this duality between the living Jesus, this divine Jesus, and the fleshly Jesus, a human Jesus in Peter's Gospel. He doesn't say at any point that the text of the Gospel of Peter is from the sect. He says that it was a text used by Docetists, so it could simply be that the Docetists did a Doka reading of this text, and he didn't do it. Serapion didn't want any text that had explicit Docetism. He didn't want any text that had the approval of the Docetist star that he had an author from Sisha. Originally none of this, or it is also possible, and this would be a second answer to this question, is that the Gospel of Peter that we have been talking about so far, this Gospel was found in the city of Achm in Egypt. It is possible that the Gospel we are referring to is not exactly the same as the one read by Serapion. The absence of citations of the text of the Gospel of Peter in antiquity is an intriguing phenomenon that raises questions about its reception and the relevance it had in the Christian communities of that period. It is possible that, due to its particular nature and content, it was not widely accepted or considered authoritative by prominent figures of the time. In addition, the fragmentation of textual traditions and the selection of works that were preserved and transmitted over time may also have contributed to this lack of reference. Another factor to be considered is the competitive environment between different currents of early Christianity, where certain narratives or texts could be favored over others, resulting in the marginalization of some works, as would be the case with the Gospel of Peter. In this way, the combination of these factors may explain why we don't find quotes or references to this text in the works of authors considered relevant in antiquity. We have one or maybe even two comments that are quite short and superficial in terms of the content presented, but we don't have any citations that can be considered or assessed in relation to this. That we could establish a comparison with the text that was found and be able to say, this is the text they mentioned before. There is no possibility of doing this, so it is plausible that the Gospel that is said to be Peter's and that was discovered in the Achim is just another text that has been attributed to the Apostle Peter throughout the history of Christianity. Over time, many texts have been credited to him, such as the first and second letters of Peter, which Eusebius of Caesarea, a prominent historian and theologian of the time, believed had been written by the Apostle Peter himself. However, it is worth noting that these letters were contested and debated in antiquity, leading to questions about their authenticity and true authorship. There is also an apocalypse attributed to Peter, as well as the acts and preaching of this apostle. As is well known, these writings were recognized by Eusebius of Caesarea, an important church historian, during the first century of the Christian era, demonstrating his knowledge of early Christian literature. Therefore, it is possible that several Gospels were attributed to the Apostle Peter over time. This situation suggests that different texts that circulated among Christian communities may later have been identified as the work of this important apostle, thus reflecting the diversity of traditions and interpretations that existed in the early stages of Christianity. Nowadays, there is a competition in the academic environment, isn't there? There is a debate among some academics about the relationship between the text attributed to Serapion and the text created by Eymene. While one group of scholars maintains that both texts are, in fact, one and the same work, another group firmly believes that these texts cannot be considered the same, arguing that they are different productions. This divergence of opinions reveals an interesting field of academic discussion about the authorship and authenticity of these writings. Did Pedro write it himself? At this point, we can conclude that, to date, there is not a single scholar who considers this gospel to have genuine and authentic authorship. In fact, we are referring to a text that can be classified as pseudo-epigraphic, i.e. it is a document that has been wrongly attributed to a prominent figure of significant importance in history, with the intention of giving it a certain authority and legitimacy. However, by analyzing its internal characteristics, it is possible to conclude that this text actually comes from at least the 2nd century of the Common Era. In view of this, it is clear that it could not have been produced by one of Jesus' apostles. Given this analysis, what would be the specificities and characteristics that clearly and unequivocally indicate that this text cannot be attributed to Peter? Certainly, one aspect that is of great relevance is the way in which the author approaches not only the word Jew, but also the Jewish community itself during the development of the content of this gospel. The Jews are often referred to in their legislation, as well as their traditions and customs. In this context, it is important to consider that Peter, being Jewish himself, would use language that reflected his cultural and religious heritage, which would make it quite peculiar and even unusual if he adopted a type of vocabulary that was not in line with these characteristics that identify him. In addition, at the beginning of the video, we mentioned that the Roman governor Pilate is totally exempt from any responsibility for the execution of Jesus Christ, and that the responsibility for Jesus' death can be largely attributed, collectively, to the Jewish people. This issue already represents a particularity that is observed in the texts that appeared later. Initially, the texts of the Gospels that are considered canonical, including the Gospel according to Matthew and the Gospel according to Luke, seek to establish Pilate's distance from responsibility for the condemnation and execution of Jesus. This effort is evident in the narratives, which reflect the intention to minimize Pilate's involvement in the actions that led to the crucifixion. Therefore, it is correct to say that these texts try, in some way, to exonerate the figure of Pilate in this context. According to Luke, there is an account that mentions that the Roman governor Pontius Pilate sought to transfer responsibility for Jesus' trial to King Herod. In addition, it is recorded that Herod, when analyzing the situation, chose to consider Jesus as a Galilean, which influenced his decision regarding the case. Herod was responsible for governing the region of Galilee, but he didn't agree with the situation involving Jesus, and so he decided to return the prisoner to Judea. This action by Herod demonstrates his refusal to deal with the case and his transfer of responsibility to another jurisdiction. In this way, the Gospel reveals that Pilate endeavors in various ways to avoid condemning Jesus, demonstrating an attempt to absolve himself of guilt. However, despite these efforts, he ends up making the decision that leads to the condemnation of the innocent, which implies that he has, even if only to a limited extent, responsibility for Jesus' fate. In the Gospel according to Matthew, there is a notorious passage that depicts a scene of great significance, where the Roman leader Pontius Pilate makes the symbolic gesture of washing his hands, thus demonstrating his attempt to absolve himself of responsibility for Jesus' condemnation. He then asks the crowd which prisoner they want released, proposing a choice between Barabbas and Jesus. The crowd unanimously and emphatically chooses to demand the execution of Jesus, asking that Barabbas be released in his place. This situation reflects the intense social pressure and complex dynamics of the time. Thus, when we analyze the passage in which Pilate decides to wash his hands, we realize that he ends up condemning Jesus. With this, we can see that even in this gospel there is a clear attempt to exempt Pilate from his responsibilities and, consequently, from Rome. However, it is important to note that this exemption is not absolute. At the end of the day, it is still Pilate who pronounces the condemnation against Jesus, and it is the Roman soldiers who brutally beat him and subject him to severe torture. On the other hand, when we consider the Gospel of Peter, the situation is different. In this account, Pilate has no involvement in the process of judging Jesus. In this context, it is the Jews, specifically the men under Herod's leadership, who are in charge of inflicting torture on Jesus, putting a cloak over him, crowning him with thorns, as well as punching and flogging him. Therefore, This differentiation between the accounts highlights the discrepancy in the representation of who actually carries out Jesus' condemnation and suffering. In this way, in this ancient gospel that is attributed to Peter, we can already see that the process of exempting Rome from any kind of responsibility, while attributing all the blame to the Jews, is well advanced. It's also worth noting that Peter's gospel frequently uses the word Jews as a synonym to refer to Jesus' enemies. On the other hand, if we analyze most of the canonical gospels, with the exception of the Gospel of John, we notice that this practice also occurs. However, when we focus on the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and Mark, we find a significant difference, because they don't generically refer to Jesus' enemies as Jews, but rather use more specific designations to identify those who opposed him. For example, Luke and Mark explicitly mention the Pharisees, the chief priests, and other figures who opposed Jesus. This is contrasted with the Gospel of John, which is considered the most recent of all the canonical Gospels, as well as the Gospel of Peter, which is also discussed in this context and which, according to the arguments presented, was probably written in a later period. In the Gospel of Peter, a text believed to have been written around the end of the 2nd century, the generic word Jews is used to designate Jesus' opponents. This choice of vocabulary is made in such a way that, when reading the text, the reader could possibly overlook this issue, right? In case you're not paying attention, it's important to point out that both Jesus' disciples and Jesus himself were of Jewish origin, right? This phenomenon of forgetfulness has manifested itself quite intensely throughout history in various periods and contexts, hasn't it? However, it's important to mention that the situation between Jews and Christians wasn't as polarized as you might think. It wasn't simply a rigid division between Jews on one side and Christians on the other. In the context of the so-called Gospel according to Peter, we can already see the presence of this identity distinction, with the Christians clearly positioning themselves in a distinct way in relation to the Jews. This evidence significantly indicates that the text in question does indeed belong to a period that is later than the initial development of Christianity. However, even if it is considered that this text was not actually written by an apostle of Jesus, and even if it is possible that it does not correspond to the gospel mentioned by historical figures such as Serapion, Origen, and Eusebius in antiquity, it is still essential to recognize that the discovery of the Achim manuscript is of extraordinary value. This manuscript is a fascinating testimony to the diversity of texts that circulated and were shared between the different Christian communities in the early days of the religion. The manuscript that was discovered in Imin probably dates back to the 6th century of the Christian era and, according to evidence, was already present in the communications of Christian communities in Egypt from the early medieval period. As for the datum of the text found within this manuscript, the question of its antiquity in relation to the manuscript itself is a science that is becoming more complex and difficult to determine. However, it's still a subject that deserves consideration and analysis, right? This account is fascinating because it reveals the existence of multiple Gospels and various texts that were attributed to prominent figures of the past, such as Peter, Mary Magdalene, and Judas. These writings, which circulated significantly among the Christian groups of the time, were considered so relevant that they were preserved as important examples by these communities. Furthermore, it is equally intriguing to note the diversity of interpretations and visions that coexisted regarding the relationship between Jews and Christians, as well as the different perceptions concerning Jesus' identity, his divine nature, and the distribution of responsibility, whether this was on the part of Rome or the Jews themselves, in relation to the events that took place in the 1st century. This whole narrative becomes fascinating, especially when we begin to reflect on the process of formation of the canon. This process takes place gradually through detailed and specific discussions that lead to the approval or disapproval of certain books. An example of this is the period involving Serapion, who was Bishop of Anch, one of the most important cities in the Roman Empire and also a place of great importance in the evolution of Christianity in the 1st centuries. Serapion, in his meticulous analysis, decided to disapprove of certain writings, but until that moment, there was no formal list that he could consult to check what could be considered part of the Bible. So there was no clear way to say, this book is in the Bible, therefore it is accepted, or this other text is not included in the Bible, therefore it must be rejected. Therefore, the process of defining what makes up the canon was still in full evolution and discussion. The process in question was still ongoing, specifically in relation to the maturing and crystallization of what could be considered the authoritative body of at least one of the ancient Christian parties, which in turn would eventually become orthodoxy. Therefore, even though different theological interpretations may arise about this gospel, it is undeniable that it is a historical document of great interest and relevance. In this sense, it is really worthwhile and enriching to take the time to read this work. For now, that's all I have to share. I would like to express my gratitude, as always, for your dedicated attention. See you in the next videos.